the Bain Free Radio Hour.
Hello and welcome to the Bain Free Radio Hour. Today we bring you Griffin Barber's interview of S.M. Stirling on The Winds of Fate, his latest entry in the To Make the Darkness Light series. After that, we jump into part 16 of the serialization of Mark Van Name's John and Lobo novel, One Jump Ahead. Hi there, I'm Griffin Barber, your host for today's edition of the Bain Free Radio Hour. Our guest today, S.M. Stirling, is here to talk to us about his latest work, The Winds of Fate. Steve hardly needs an introduction to Bain fans as his collaborations read like a who's who of SF. Dave Drake, Jerry Pournelle, Larry Niven, and Raymond E. Feist all figure prominently in his prolific body of work. And he's done a great many works purely of his own invention, including the incredible novels of The Change. Often dark and moody, Steve's works contain an excellent grasp of history and militaria that has inspired and informed a generation of readers of science fiction and military SF in particular. The Winds of Fate is the sequel to Turn the Tide, a time travel story in which our modern characters are sent back to the Roman Empire in the 2nd century Common Era. It's now been a few years and our heroes have established themselves and have seemingly course-corrected the Empire when they discover the Armageddon they'd escaped may happen again. Hello and welcome, Steve.
Hi. Glad to be here.
Hardest questions first. What's the coolest aspect of The Winds of Fate for you?
Doing stuff set in 2nd century Rome, which has always been one of my favorite periods. You know, of course, the 3rd century is not so great, but 2nd century Rome was actually sort of the height of classical civilization, and a lot of people fail to appreciate quite how high the height was. Like they were shipping ornamental building stone from Anatolia to Britannia during that period. And they've discovered bits of terra siligata in impoverished huts, the ruins of impoverished huts near Hadrian's Wall. So there was a great deal going on.
A lot of transfer, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, they're very mobile population, let's put it that way. It's kind of fascinating how much they moved around.
Yeah. And if you read Tacitus, a generation after the Claudius took over Britannia, the local chieftains' kids were wearing togas and studying Latin and sending their kids to Athens to get some polish.
Right. It always fascinated me how rapidly any place that was absorbed into the empire became Roman. Like the Romanization was so rapid.
Yeah, except sometimes for the Greek parts. The Greeks were a bit snooty.
Yeah,
but,
and remained so.
Yeah.
Right, all the way up until the Ottomans came in and messed around with their state. So clearly you didn't stumble on it. So has this been something you've been studying since you were a kid, or you've been?
Yeah, well, history is my hobby, and I get to do research and I can deduct it, and it's still my hobby. So, and the way history progresses and the causative factors and that sort of thing have always been an interest of mine. I've come to the conclusion that history is largely a series of low probability accidents bouncing off each other.
For sure.
I can give you an example of that. Frederick the Great emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War. Maria Theresa got France and Russia together, and they all tried to take Silesia back, which Frederick the Great had stolen after promising not to. And the reason that Prussia wasn't completely crushed in that war, apart from Frederick the Great being a very good general, was that the Tsarina Elizabeth of Russia died at 53, and her nephew, her heir and nephew, was a besotted Frederick the Great fanboy. So he dropped out of the war, changed sides. And that's what allowed Frederick to survive. And, what are the odds of that happening?
Right. Especially given, again, the difficulties of transfer of knowledge. Like, how do you know about them aside from the courts discussing them and that kind of thing? And to what degree were they able to, it wasn't like they were flipping open their phone and going, oh yeah, I'm going to watch 800 videos of Frederick doing
Yeah.
his thing.
Well, he was a shrewd publicist too, or like World War I started with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand.
Right.
And that really did cause the war because Franz Ferdinand was heir to the Austrian throne. He had a veto over foreign policy, and he was absolutely determined not to get into any situation where Austria fought Russia because he thought it would doom the dynasty. And he was right. He
Right.
wasn't a very agreeable guy, but he was not stupid at all. And I don't think Dragovic Apis, the Black Hand guy in Serbia who sent the assassins, expected them to succeed because he picked them all because they were in their teens, and Austrian law forbade executing people under a certain age. So they
Well,
threw.
didn't they also agree to do it because they all had tuberculosis? That's something I've heard.
Um, yeah, most of them died of tuberculosis in Austrian prisons, and well, one of them mooched off as soon as they got back to back to Bosnia.
Right.
Um, then they threw the bomb and missed, and just injured some guys in the next car. And the guy who threw the bomb tried to drown himself in the river, and he threw himself in, but it was the dry season, so it was only 6 inches deep, and all he did was sprain his ankle.
Right.
And then Gavrilo Princip mooched off to have lunch because he was disappointed. He tried to join the Serbian army, but they turned him down because he was too feeble. And he comes out of the place he had lunch in, and Franz Ferdinand's driver took a wrong turn,
Yep.
turned down a road where there was no bridge over the river, tried to back up, stalled his car right in front of Gavrilo Princip.
Yep.
I mean, it was like the Three Stooges from hell.
Oh, yeah.
The odds of that happening were just so minuscule.
And him having the wherewithal, the inner fortitude to actually go through with it, because the number of assassination plots that anybody's tried is always dependent on whether the person's actually at that moment has the opportunity and has frankly the balls to go ahead and pull it off.
Oh yeah, well, he was a demented Serbian nationalist, but
Yeah.
He was like 6 feet away from them when the car stalled.
Yeah.
And
I think he was like in a doorway, and he was at eye level because he was up on the stairs in the doorway, so he was able to.
Yeah, exactly.
Franz Ferdinand. Yep.
And and then he shot them both, and then he took his suicide pill, but it was past its sell-by date, so it just gave him a stomach ache.
Yeah, so the assassins are sprained ankle
and a stomach ache.
And then things went downhill from there for him.
Yeah.
So I dig that we are sharing the love for history, because I absolutely agree with you, and that the oddities of moment, that chance that comes, and it's one of those things too, is that when an opportunity presents itself to you, take it. If you don't, it's likely that you're going to miss all of that history.
Or Columbus, the crown of Castile backed Columbus. And the reason Columbus thought he could get to Asia by sailing west was that he'd mistranslated the original calculation of the diameter of the Earth, which was quite accurate. But when he translated it through several different measuring systems, it got cut in half.
Yeah.
And, well, everybody knew the world was round. They had since Hellenistic times.
Yeah.
And most people knew that the actual diameter of the Earth was about twice what Columbus thought it was. But apparently Isabella of Castile didn't.
No.
And so she backed him. If the Americas hadn't been in the way, he would have died of thirst a quarter of the way across the Pacific.
Just like the Spaniards in later missions did when they tried to cross the Pacific.
Yeah.
From Argentina,
west coast of Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah.
Eventually they got to the Philippines, but it was a comedy of errors.
Yeah.
I mean, he knew how to get there and he knew how to get back. He just never realized. He died convinced that he was on some islands off the coast of Japan.
Yep.
So
fascinating stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and the Portuguese discovered Brazil in 1500 because they were on their way to India, and the way to get to India in a sailing ship is to travel southwest.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and then curve around.
I learned that doing Mission to the Mughals, the 1636 novel that I wrote. Was the thing from there was So they had to sail all the way out there to get back so they could line up their rounding of the Cape.
Yeah, well, there's a counterclockwise current and wind pattern in the southern Atlantic and a clockwise one in the northern Atlantic. That was the basic discovery that made the age of exploration possible.
Right.
And you you, you don't sail directly in a sailing ship.
No.
You have to get the winds and currents right.
Yep, absolutely.
Anyway, let's go on.
Getting back to the Columbus type tip, which character in Winds of Fate surprised you?
Black Jade, the Chinese linguist, who they bring in at the last minute because the previous one did something that no one ever mentions and met a fate that no one ever talks about.
Right.
And she was on board with modernizing China, ancient Han China, until she realized that there was an alternative, because 21st century politics really aren't very relevant in 165 CE, but
Right.
Once you've got another group of travelers from the future, and she really, really, really doesn't like Colonel Liu, who
Yeah.
is the head of the.
So there we go.
Chinese
I think he's the one you would want to avoid like the plague.
Well, he's just very sincere, shall we put it that way?
In the way that all security apparatchiks are generally
Sincere.
themselves. Yes.
Yeah. Well, if they're not sincere, the regime falls. So.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. And he, one of that dynamic between those two characters is one of the most entertaining things about this book for me, was to see, like, here's this person who has to keep her opinions to herself all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise she will be destroyed, not just killed, destroyed. And it's not just in speaking her mind, but in her deeds. She has to be incredibly careful about how she says anything, but also if she's just perceived as doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, I was in Chengdu for the Worldcon in 23, and you would not believe the surveillance systems there. I went through like 6 facial recognition stations on the way to Chengdu from Hong Kong.
Wow.
They record everything.
Yeah. I wonder if it'll end up being a kind of an East German kind of thing where they're just overrun with their own intelligence.
Well, no, they've computerized it heavily, and I think they're using AI to bring stuff to people's attention. But my God, the Chengdu Worldcon was interesting. The fans were very much like fans, and there were lots of police around, and I noticed that the older ones looked formidable, short but formidable. The younger ones looked like pencil neck geeks.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, which character would you want as an ally?
Artorias, Arthur Venenberg. He's all round competent.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to say the Emperor, but because
Marcus Aurelius, yes,
seem to have a shine on Marcus Aurelius too.
He's a good person to have on your side, and he's extremely smart. In fact, he's so smart that he realizes there are things he doesn't do well, so he delegates them to other people.
Right. Yeah. Not only is he that smart, he's also good at choosing his allies.
Oh yeah, yeah. He had a bit of a blind spot about his son Commodus, but that gets overcome.
Yeah, it does. I forgot about that.
Oh, and Commodus gets heavily into distilled liquor,
right?
Which is another introduction from the time travelers.
Another time, a tech transfer.
Yeah. Well, they introduced it to. It's one of the first things you can introduce. All you need is a kettle and a coil of copper tubing, and people will be enthusiastic about it. Although when people are first exposed to distilled liquor, it tends to have rather drastic effects.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, societies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But triply distilled liquor is a good disinfectant too. So
Oh yeah.
So which is why Marcus Aurelius's younger son Verus survives in The Winds of Fate. He died of an infection from an operation to remove a growth behind his ear.
In the
And
timeline, right?
yeah, in our history. And now Galen, who's the court physician, knows about infection and how to prevent it. So he doesn't.
Very cool. That's one of the fun things about any kind of alternate history is being able to, hey, what would happen if, and
Yeah,
go from there.
there's a surprising number of things that are possible to do even in the remote past if people have the idea. Um, the concept of planning technological change is actually quite a recent one. People stumbled across things, and if they caught on, they caught on, and if they didn't, they didn't. Um, the first people to domesticate the horse could have made saddles with stirrups and wooden frames.
Yeah, yeah. Nothing stopping them.
Yeah, nothing stopping them. They just didn't have the idea.
Right.
And it took 3,600 years for someone to get the idea, which happened in East Asia. A
Right.
lot of a lot of inventions were developed in East Asia, and it's one of those things where people look at it and go, "Ah, why didn't I think of that?"
Right.
And then they can do it. There's a whole lot of stuff like that. Wheelbarrows, for example,
Yep.
or the big bottleneck in food production in ancient agriculture in the old world was harvesting. Because with a sickle, you can do a quarter to a third of an acre of grain a day. And
Right.
that's as much as you can possibly do. Now, the Romans had scythes. They got them from the Celts, along with a lot of other stuff. Chainmail, for example, and their characteristic helmet.
Right.
And you can't cut grain with a scythe because it scatters.
Right.
And if you break it up, it shatters and falls out of the head. But if you put a couple of wooden fingers in a frame over the scythe blade,
Right.
you can harvest 3 acres a day instead of a third of an acre a day, which is, 9, 10 times as much.
Right.
And that's the
A
big
person.
bottleneck
Yeah.
because you've only got 2 weeks to get the wheat in,
Right.
or it shatters and falls over, or shatters and falls over.
Yeah.
So they introduced that. And at that point, big landowners loved them because big Roman landowners had a terrible problem with harvesting their crops, particularly grain, because a man can, even with the crude implements they had then, a man can plant 5 times as much as he can harvest. So they hired harvest gangs because if you had enough slaves to harvest the wheat, they'd be sitting around twiddling their thumbs and eating their heads off.
Wasn't that something that happened with the Spartacus rebellion as well? Is it several of those work gangs were they were not employed at the time because it wasn't the harvest season?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and of course Spartacus was a gladiator.
Yeah, no, but I'm talking about the later rebellion when he
Yeah.
started freeing everybody else. Was he had a
Yeah.
lot of there were a lot of slaves that were or work gangs that were not employed at the time, and they're like, yeah, we'll loot that with you.
Yeah, and you have to find them work.
Yeah.
Like before the Civil War, most Southern plantations grew all or nearly all of their own food.
Right.
And the reason for that was that you had to keep enough hands to pick the cotton or
Right.
harvest the tobacco. And if you did that, unless they grew their own food, they'd be sitting idle and not doing anything
Yeah.
for
And
most of the year.
consuming all the food that you did have or you had to
Yeah,
purchase.
you'd have to buy it. So
Right.
growing it was common sense. After the Civil War, um, cotton planters stopped producing their own food, and they just said, go feed yourself.
Right. It became exclusively a cash crop, which also wasn't good for the fields.
Oh no, it wasn't.
Yeah,
And
not putting any legumes or putting any nitrogen back in the soil. Yeah, so
yeah,
that's one of the things that's been fascinating to me. Being from Illinois originally, having that the uh, agrarian concerns, which were foremost in everybody's mind in the empire, because a famine, in Egypt. Oftentimes meant that there was there's going to be a change of emperor in Rome.
yeah, because a lot of Rome's supplies came from Egypt and North Africa and Spain. In fact, it drew on the whole Mediterranean.
Yeah.
The works that they put into the port at Ostia which was Rome's seaport, were just like amazing. It was like a 500-acre enclosure
Yep.
and canals to the Tiber and all sorts of things. The Romans were really, really good at big engineering projects.
Yep.
They did them all by rule of thumb. They didn't their maths were terrible. Their geometry was fairly good, but their ordinary maths were awful because they didn't have positional arithmetic. And so they overbuilt everything. That's why one of the reasons we've got so many Roman ruins.
Yes. Which, just real quick as an aside, what is your favorite ruin that you have seen yourself?
The Pantheon.
No.
You know, they altered the aggregate and the concrete of the dome. So using lighter and lighter stuff as it got up to the top.
Yeah.
And the floor is gently tilted so that water that comes in through that oculus at the top runs off.
Yeah.
It's really an amazing piece of work. That was redone in Hadrian's time.
Right.
It says that Marcus Agrippa, who was the first Augustus's right-hand man, did it, and he did. But they reworked it substantially in Hadrian's time, and yeah. But like Roman roads, they lasted forever, and one of the reasons was that wherever they could, they built them like 8 feet deep with rocks set in concrete and layers of. And
one of the neatest things about being in Spain when I was a kid was walking across the aqueduct, walking across the valley on the aqueduct.
Yeah.
Still extant, still standing, still running water in it. A thousand, nearly 2,000 years after it was, established.
So, if you've ever seen Time Team, it's a British show about.
I love it. Love Time Team.
Oh, Phil Harding has the same accent as my father's mother did because she came from rural Wiltshire too. But anyway, they discovered a couple of aqueducts, small aqueducts built for villas that were still running, like 1,500 years later.
Yep.
And that shows you, the Romans really knew how to handle water. But oddly enough, everything the Romans did was constant flow. Yeah. Like their public latrines, which they had in most cities, had a constant flow of water underneath them. And that increased the overall demand for water rather substantially.
Right.
It was an odd civilization. They had incredible accomplishments in some areas and incredible weaknesses in others. For example, they didn't have any really good artificial light. Yeah. They had oil lamps with a wick into a vat of oil, and believe me, those really aren't very bright.
No.
And so one of the things
they did do a little bit of reflectoring, didn't they?
Yeah, polished bronze.
Yeah.
And one of the things my time travelers introduce is kerosene lanterns, which actually do give quite a good light, and you can read comfortably by them.
Yeah, it's a whiter light too.
Yeah, and of course they introduced mirrors, actually modern type mirrors. The Romans used bronze or silvered bronze or tinned bronze, and glass mirrors of the type that were invented in the Middle Ages are vastly better. They make a fair amount of money off of a couple of things like that.
Yeah, which I liked as well, because that's one of the motivating factors for people to accept change is to show that it's profitable. One of the things I really enjoyed about this series so far is that we're not gonna just tell you, we're gonna show you.
Yeah, we're gonna show you and show you how you can make a mint.
Exactly, while you're doing it. So, and we're not going to try and conserve it and keep it for ourselves as the great wisdom kind of thing. But although that kind of seems to be going into what's happening on the other side of the planet, is that they aren't going to show you how to do it. They're going to try and keep that knowledge to themselves. So, some
they spread around widely. The Chinese time travelers who got sent back to exactly the same date. That's probably a constraint in the machine, but none of the time travelers are physicists, and none of them know it for certain. They get sent back to late Eastern Han Dynasty China, and the Chinese were further along in the process of imperial decline than the Romans were, and the emperor in China at the time, Emperor Ling, came to the throne at 12, and he was totally uninterested in any serious work. He was a party animal.
Right.
And
He's a kid.
yeah, the Chinese time travelers have to secure influence over him in order to prevent the Yellow Turban Uprising, which was a peasant uprising. It was defeated, they always are.
Right.
But the generals who defeated it then became warlords and declared themselves kings. And then the empire broke up into the 3 kingdoms and then the 7 kingdoms. And there was a long, long spell of interscene warfare and nomadic conquest before China was united again.
Was it called the Warring States period?
No, that was before
that's before this. That's right.
Yeah, it's before the Qin.
Yeah.
Do you know the Qin weren't Confucians? They were legalists. It's another school of Chinese philosophy.
Yep.
One of the maxims of the legalists was punishment produces obedience. Obedience produces discipline. Discipline produces virtue. Therefore, punishment produces virtue. And there's the cartoon History of the Universe has a great scene where the guy who led the rebellion, who founded the Han Dynasty and led the rebellion against the Qin, is sitting with a bunch of peasant conscripts by the side of the road, and it's raining heavily. And he says, "Brothers, what's the penalty for being late?" And they say, "Death." And he says, "What's the penalty for rebellion?" And they say, "Death." And he says, "Well, brothers, I've got news for you. We're late."
That's very,
and that's the weakness of punishment produces virtue.
All right, for sure. Yeah, especially if you go reach right immediately for the death switch instead of gradated punishment.
Yeah, the legalists were really an unpleasant crew, but then the Qin dynasty were unpleasant people. They were frontiersmen, and they'd been fighting nomads to their northwest for a long, long time. So when they finally licked them and turned around on the other Chinese states, there was a good deal of complaint that they weren't fighting by the rules and that sort of thing. And
we're just fighting by your rules.
Yeah, we're fighting by our rules.
Yeah. That's why we're winning.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That was one of the more fascinating things because I don't know a great deal about it. I did know about the Yellow Turban Rebellion because I've played a few games called Total War, and they have in the 3 kingdoms they have the origins of the 3 kingdoms is of course the Yellow Turban Rebellion.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, the one of the things that Colonel Liu does is get rid of the eunuch faction at the Eastern Han court. There were 2 groups, basically the Confucians and the eunuch faction, and the eunuch faction was totally corrupt. And the Emperor Ling sort of leaned on them because they flattered him and provided entertainment.
Yeah.
And the Confucians were a bit dour and virtuous. So Liu helps get rid of the eunuch faction. In fact, at one point he uses an automatic revolver, which startles everybody.
Yeah. It's very different from the tack that Arturius and everybody take.
Yeah. Well, they've got a very sensible emperor, last of the 5 good emperors.
Right.
5. There's Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and then Marcus Aurelius. And that was the longest spell of peace that the Roman Empire ever had.
Right.
And then they got Commodus, and believe me, you've seen Gladiator, and Commodus actually he didn't kill his father. He didn't smother him in his armpit.
No.
But he was just about as bad as portrayed there. And he also had a complete fascination with the arena, although he made sure that the fights were rigged when he was participating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to risk my emperorness with getting cut or something. No, we can't have that.
No, yes. And
he was also creepy about his sister, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it required a good deal of self-restraint to be a good Roman emperor because you could do whatever the hell you wanted.
Right.
A while.
Especially the early ones, yeah.
Yeah, if you
or the mid to early.
Well, emperors who completely disregarded upper class public opinion tended not to live very long.
Right.
But while they lived, they did whatever the hell they wanted.
For sure.
Yeah, Antonius Pius was a good emperor, but he never left the vicinity of Rome. He did select his governors and so forth rather well. Marcus Aurelius got around more, but then he had the Marcomannic Wars to
Make him
uh,
around, yeah.
yeah, and
Oversee.
yeah, and he actually conquered the Marcomanni and the Quadi, but Commodus just threw it away, because Commodus never wanted to go much outside Rome either.
Right.
Um,
Why would I want to do that? All my entertainments are here.
yeah, it was the biggest city in the world, and you could get virtually anything there. Although it was also a death trap. All big cities before the 19th century were death traps. The closest approach to a self-sustaining city was Edo, Tokyo in
Yeah.
Japan,
Mhm.
and they had a rough balance between reproduction and deaths. But like in Shakespeare's London, there were 5 burials for every baptism. Of
Yeah.
course, the Japanese took baths and the English didn't at the time, but you
And
know,
rigorously did that. Rigorously had, and their food preparation almost always involved boiling.
yeah,
Right.
and they carted all the human waste out of town to compost it.
Yep.
Yeah, late Tokugawa Japan had actually something approaching a steady state economy.
Right.
It was sustainable. Like they had a forest policy that sustained the forests and all sorts of things, but it wasn't exactly affluent unless you were a noble or a rich merchant.
Yeah. And usually on the really affluent side of that, not
Yeah,
the middle of the road people, especially everybody talks about how the samurai and all this. Yeah, there were some really hard scramble samurai.
yeah, there were.
Depending on the era too, because sometimes there was no difference between them and a poor farmer.
Yeah, except that they had a sword
Right.
and
And the
were
right to carry it. Yeah.
inclined to use it too.
Oh yeah. Very much so.
Actually, technically, a samurai in Tokugawa Japan could cut down any commoner he wanted. In fact, that was heavily discouraged because
Right.
it screwed up administration, but theoretically he could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. I'm trying to remember the Roman general that said no to being made anything greater than he was, and was basically from behind the traces of his team while he was plowing the field. I can't remember the name of him.
Cincinnatus.
Cincinnati, that's right, Cincinnati. I knew who that was. I just couldn't remember it.
Yeah,
But
that's one of
I love that quote, and I can't remember the exact one. But no, I'm going to be a farmer again, and everybody's like, but you're like the greatest thing since sliced bread. Why would you go back to being a farmer? Because my duty's done.
yeah,
There's
and
nothing more for me to do.
also because emperors had to be paranoid about their backs.
Or kings at the kings that were trying to reestablish the monarchy from the republic. Because
Yeah,
Cincinnati was earlier, wasn't he? He was in.
he was in the
Yeah,
Republican period.
yeah,
But the thing is, one of the reasons that the empire never had a stable succession, except for the adoptions of the 5 good emperors, was that it became a monarchy essentially in Augustus' time, Octavian's time,
right,
and that was in historic time. I mean, they had a literate class, they had written histories, that sort of thing. So they never developed the medieval European, pardon me, reverence for dynastic succession, dynastic legitimacy, because the European monarchies went back into prehistoric legendary time,
right.
and the religious belief that in a certain family having the right to rule transferred over into the Christian period, and the Christian Church encouraged primogeniture,
Yep,
which ended the Vikings always had kings' sons cutting each other's throats,
right.
and primogeniture put an end to that too. So for a long time, um, European politics had a restraint on it. You couldn't just declare yourself king. No one would obey you, and the church would anathematize you.
Yeah, for sure.
But in Rome, if you got the army on your side, you were basically emperor.
Yep. No, and that
And
was the same case with the Burgundians too. Like their origins are in and amongst the tribes that were in the Low Countries before the
Mhm.
Saxons came in and kind of did all that. So, and they had no primogeniture, but it was the advent of both the Franks, the Saxons, and the Catholic or Christian Church that all kind of combined to make them. Maybe we had to do some primogeniture and have a certain heir, so our kingdoms don't splinter within 3 generations.
Yeah.
That
Oh, do you know what the name Saxon comes from?
yeah, sex.
Yeah. So basically, it means guys with the big knives
Yeah,
or shivmen,
yeah,
stabbers.
yeah. No, there's some amazing stuff. One of the things I just learned from this book that I'm doing right now, I'm reading right now, the Burgundians. About them is I speak French, right? And I one of the things for talking about your friend is un copain,
Mhm,
and I had no idea of the etymology of that word.
mhm.
Copain, your friends that you sit down and join together to eat the bread, which was the foundation of your meal, was the trencher of bread that everything was served on.
Mhm.
So these are
Yeah.
your copain, and now it's copine, copain. You have all these different variations on it, but that's the origin of it was is that it was the people that you sat down and broke bread with.
Yeah.
Uh,
Je parle
and
français aussi, mais j'ai un accent incroyable.
oh, c'est pas mal, là. C'est pas mal. Moi, j'ai l'accent suisse. Alors, tous les Français, on peut emmerder parce que on écoute mon accent et les mots que j'ai utilisés. Uh,
Yeah. Actually, Swiss German has a terrible accent too, according
oh,
to
yeah.
most
Uh,
Germans.
according to the Germans and the
Mhm.
Austrians, not according to the Swiss.
No.
They have the right accent, right? But the Genevois and the French speaking part of the Switzerland tend to totally agree with the French. Yeah, we've got a different accent. Whatever. We still, because one of the things I just discussed, because in this club we have people that are speaking, from all different parts of walks of life in different regions. And I said, this is back in the 90s, and one of the biggest distinctions between Belgian and Swiss French is saying 90 instead
Mhm.
of 90,
Mhm.
which is 4 times 20 plus 10, which is about how, I think that must be Roman. It must be like a concept that came about with the Roman numerals or something. I'm not sure. But,
Well,
and
yeah.
the gal I was talking to, I was in a group of like 3 people. She kind of took me on about she smiled and told her non-French speaking husband, she's like, yeah, he just talked like a Swiss.
Mm.
And I'm like, yeah, practically. I didn't have to do higher maths to tell you 90.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Actually, the Roman numeral system was incredibly awkward, and it made keeping accounts really difficult. And it's surprising how well they administered things, considering that their accounting was terrible, and they didn't have any decent filing system. So you relied on the inherited memory of successive generations of clerks to be able to find things. So if you bribed the clerk, they didn't find it.
right.
Yeah. Um, so uh, alphabetized filing systems and hanging files and double entry bookkeeping are all really important, and that's part of the ideational technology that my time travelers introduced back
Very
to
cool.
Rome. Luckily, they've got, well, not luckily, the uh, Professor Futch, the guy who invented the time machine, carefully calculated what sort of specialties he needed, and then got them all over there with a fairy story about being able to date artifacts.
Yeah,
And they didn't believe that it was a time machine until they ended up in the second century.
right.
They thought he was a kook.
It's a really neat conceit of the series that I really enjoyed. We've ranged pretty far, but so the Wind of Fate takes a different tack from that the original one, with the cast of characters being pretty diverse in their background, mostly American or almost entirely American, or but different ethnicities.
Mhm.
Whereas in this, the Winds of Fate, we go with a fairly monolithic background for the new characters, and their focus and techniques are different from Artorias and his crew.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
was this a choice made based on who you believe would have had the best chance of opposing the Roman Empire Mark II? or because of some current international relations between East and West?
Well, um, I studied the way the Chinese government works,
Hmm.
and it has some severe weaknesses, although it does manage to get things done. But one of the weaknesses is that no one likes to tell the boss the bad news. That makes you deeply unpopular.
Right.
So, I've often said that I write science fiction, and so do Chinese statisticians, um, and that's true. On a small scale, like Colonel Lou's running it, that doesn't necessarily work badly because the guy on top can check stuff up, travel around, that sort of thing. But in a really huge state like modern China, I don't think Xi knows what's going on. Um, I mean, he knows some things that are going on, but a lot of the stuff he reads, he gets reports, and the reports are largely fictional. I don't think he realized what sort of demographic problems they were in until very late. I was in Chengdu for the Worldcon, and virtually every person I met who was younger than I was an only child.
Right.
Yeah, I remember talking to a girl, and she said, like there are two or three boys for every girl in my age group. And I said, well, doesn't that have any positive effects? And she said, no, they're all dweebs uh, and desperate.
Yeah. Probably doesn't help the dweebiness either.
Yeah. And you notice that each generation was smaller than the last, but each generation was also taller than the last. The youngest generation, the people in their 20s, were about the same height as Americans, but each one went down.
Right.
Yeah, it was interesting. So yeah, the Chinese time travelers take a somewhat different approach. Like, for example, Liu introduces gunpowder weapons,
Mhm.
but he doesn't try to push the technology. He sticks with flintlock muskets and cast iron cannon. By the way, the Chinese had cast iron in this period, and the Romans did not.
Right.
Um, the Chinese invented a lot of stuff up until the 1500s. They were like the first with nearly everything: paper, printing, rudders.
The paper was
Compass.
the big one I was thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, um, but they introduced them gradually. Like in the 11th century, the Chinese had coal-fired blast furnaces, um, and that was at the time of the Norman conquest of England.
Super advanced. Yeah. Super advanced. Yeah.
And in the 13th century, they had wells thousands of feet deep that they used to tap natural gas and use the natural gas to evaporate brine. There were reasons they considered themselves the Middle Kingdom and everyone else deplorable savages, besides the usual human, my tribe good, your tribe shit, kill, kill, kill. Um, and the conceit was a severe handicap in the 19th century when the British came along and started beating on them
Right.
and selling cheap dope. Um, but it took them a while to realize that they weren't in the forefront of everything, because getting beaten in a battle didn't phase them, because that had happened before the Mongols and so forth,
Yeah. It happened a lot before. Yeah.
and the Manchu, and they didn't consider that a proof of civilization.
No.
Um,
Might be time for a regime change, but it's not proof that you're civilized.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the when the British introduced steam gunboats on the Chinese rivers, the Chinese tried to match them by having a paddle wheeler that was powered by essentially a hamster wheel with dozens of peasants inside it.
Oh, jeez.
That really didn't work well.
No.
Um, but you know, the Chinese were more advanced than anyone else for a long, long, long time. And Liu takes advantage of that. I mean, they've got blast furnaces, they've got cast iron. He just needs to introduce a few improvements, and they introduce new crops and stuff.
Right.
That's very significant in both cases, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Um, the Professor Futch sends them back with a selection of seeds, like corn, maize, potatoes, all sorts of stuff like that,
Right.
and cotton, which they send to Egypt eventually. Um, and that's a major improvement.
Oh yeah.
Potatoes had an enormous influence on Europe once they were introduced and people started eating them.
That's why the potato famine was so devastating, is because populations had exploded because they were eating them.
Yeah, you can live off a quarter acre of potatoes,
Right.
and some skim milk, which is what the Irish did.
Yep.
You can't live off a quarter acre of wheat.
No.
No, no, you need several acres of wheat
Yep.
or
Yep.
barley or even oats to live off.
Well,
And
and the time of the requirement to produce the wheat, right? You have to
yeah,
do things with the wheat when you pull it out of the ground. Potato,
yeah, you just put it in a sack and put it in
yeah,
the and corn yields a lot more than wheat does,
right.
3 or 4 times more, even under primitive cultivation circumstances. So that was the Columbian exchange, and
Yep.
they're anticipating it. The same thing happens in China, although they introduce more tropical crops there. Things like cassava, which is also an American crop.
Yep.
Cassava is the tropical equivalent of the potato. You can live off a quarter or a third of an acre of it. And other things like, well, it turns out the Romans really like tomatoes. They introduce American style pizza, and the Romans go bananas for it.
Right.
Same thing for Texan pit barbecue sauce.
Yep.
The Romans loved sharp, strong tastes.
Yeah.
I think because a lot of the foods they ate were bland, so they just really loved
Well,
sharp
that the fish sauce, the gurma,
garum.
garum,
Liquid.
garum is just oh
Yeah, it's when you think about it, it's sort of revolting, but it had a very strong taste, and they used it like ketchup
yep,
on
exactly.
everything. That's another thing they introduced, ketchup.
Tomato ketchup,
Yeah, tomato ketchup.
because you got to be clear, because garum could technically be a
No,
ketchup.
it's actually it's very much like Vietnamese nuoc mam,
Yep.
and I've had nuoc mam, and I wasn't an enthusiast.
Yeah. No, I'm not. Yeah. I'm not a big fish fan generally. I love to fish. I am not a big fish fan, but
Mhm.
if I am,
I'm allergic.
it's going to be a sport fish usually.
I'm allergic to seafood, and it's Jim Bain's fault.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I was doing a book launch party back when I first sold some books to Bain, and he said, "Go bananas on the refreshments." So I ordered a bunch of abalone sushi,
Mm.
and I ate some of it myself, and I turned into a giant pulsing hive for 3 days. And then it turned out that I didn't think it had made me allergic to anything but abalone. So I was at a convention in Boston, and I had a tuna fish sandwich, which, when I was a university student, I lived on tuna fish.
Right. Yeah. Why wouldn't
And suddenly my throat started to swell shut.
you? Ooh, so
And
scary.
they rushed me to Beth Israel. And the doctor there turned out to be a fan of mine and wanted to talk books while my throat was swelling shut.
Yeah. While you're whistling through your throat.
Yeah.
Ouch.
That was
Wow.
an alarming
Yeah,
sensation. I
I've,
eventually had
I've,
to tell him, if you
it's,
want more books, cure me.
yeah, it's scary to be around somebody who's going through that. I've done that twice. In my previous career, I was another officer had a peanut allergy, and she somehow got some nuts, and she was doing that. And like I said, it's whistling through your throat is about the scariest thing you can hear, and
Yeah,
I
it's
can
alarming.
imagine it being you doing it. Right? Oh, so
Yeah.
scary.
I I wonder why we're allergic to so much.
Yeah, I I I don't know. I think that's we've lost the seasonality of things.
Hmm.
I think that might contribute to it. Um,
Yeah.
and people are surviving things that would have killed them in the first place, and they wouldn't have
Yeah.
necessarily gotten to the point where they made kids that were allergic to stuff.
Yeah. Well, kids died. A lot of kids died in the old days.
Yeah,
In as late as 1900, it was 156 out of 1,000 British children died before the age of 5. It's only like fairly recently that infant mortality levels have gone way, 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 way down.
yeah. And
And
the resultant explosion in our population, and the Chinese going back to the Chinese and their attempt to control that explosion of population. But
they overcorrected.
yeah, which is what we do, right? We tend to be,
Yeah. Well, human beings have an instinct to have sex, and they have an instinct to bond with children, but they don't have an instinct to reproduce because it wasn't necessary. Because if you had sex, you reproduced.
right,
Evolution is a kludge; it's a random process.
right.
So, am I showing myself? Yeah.
A little
Okay.
bit. Now you are. You're much better in there. You were a little bit
Well,
speaking us to us from below.
yeah. That's the thing about evolution. It's a kludge. Um, we're perfectly suited to be hunter gatherers, but not necessarily to live in a post-industrial society.
Yeah, for sure. From everything from just our physical responses to our environment to which
Mhm.
could go into the allergy stuff too. Again, being transiting because we would normally be moving around to find
Yeah.
other resources, right? So we wouldn't be
Mhm.
sticking around in one region long enough to develop allergies to things.
Yeah. Actually, that I think part of the surviving Neanderthal genes in modern humans deal with the immune system. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's almost all that survived of the original mixtures. They found people who were they've genetically determined that they found bodies that were half Neanderthal or quarter Neanderthal,
right.
but there was a strong selective pressure against those genes, except in a few areas.
Yeah, I have 10 times I think it's 10 times the genetic markers for than the average person for the genetic markers for Neanderthal.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
eh,
Well, genetics has actually done a great deal for history recently, especially ancient DNA work. Um, Robert Reich, was he the guy? Yeah, he started it, and uh, there was for a long time there was an anti-migrationist sentiment among historians. They tended to underestimate the amount people moved around and
right.
populations placed each other,
Yeah.
and then they ended up with egg on their face because ancient DNA research showed that that happened fairly often.
Right.
And I was always a migrationist, so I considered that to be like sweet revenge.
Yeah.
Right? Um, yeah. So, and it's corrected a good many errors. But when they first started doing genetic surveys, they detected a European admixture in Indian tribes that didn't have any. Historically,
Right.
they showed that they didn't have any, and it turned out that Amerindians are only about two-thirds East Asian. The other third is a population that's extinct but left traces that's called ancient North Eurasians.
Hmm.
And ancient North Eurasians were
Makes
also
sense
about
going
half
across
the
the land
ancestry.
bridge.
Yeah, they were also about half the ancestry of the Yamnaya, the original Proto-Indo-European speakers,
Yeah.
and they imported it into Europe. So that's why it seemed that they'd undergone European admixture because they just had a common ancestor about
Yeah.
20,000
Both
back.
populations had a common ancestor. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Very
but
cool.
lots of stuff like that. Oh, and genetic research can also confirm family stories.
Oh yeah. Or deny them.
Yeah, my my first Stirling in Newfoundland was a surgeon on a Royal Navy frigate in 1800. They had a brush with a French privateer in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they stopped off in St. John's and put ashore the wounded and the surgeon. And then they forgot about them. For some reason, the Royal Navy just never looked them up again.
Right.
So they got better or not and married local girls and settled in. And the Stirlings lived in Twillingate for a while, which is a town fairly near St. John's. And a Micmac raiding party was inland going after the Beothuk. The Micmac and the Beothuk just hated each other.
Yeah.
And for some reason, they brought a kid back, a 3-year-old boy. And they said, "Well, does anyone want this kid, or we'll throw him in the ocean?" And a childless local family took him in, adopted him, raised him. He became a schooner captain, married a local girl, had all sorts of kids, and eventually everybody in that area was descended from him. And I am myself. That's a family legend, and it was confirmed when I had DNA
Neat.
search
Very-
done. I'm two
Yeah.
percent Amerindian. And since three of my four grandparents were born in England, that's via the Stirlings.
Very cool. Yeah. So half of my family is Irish, and the other half is basically from Scotland to Wales. No
Mhm.
Cornishmen allowed, but everybody else
Yeah.
we have
Oh,
all
well,
them.
they found out that in 2500 BC, there was a migration from Europe and what's now the Netherlands into the British Isles. And within a century or two, there was a 93% genetic turnover. The new population completely replaced the old one.
Wow. Huh.
The old one was a mixture of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and Anatolian farmers who migrated across Europe. But anyway, um, that was a shock to archaeologists. And I remember getting into a conversation with one, and he was saying, well, maybe the Neolithic farmers all died off from some sort of disease. And I said, or maybe they just looked at the tall blonde coolness of the newcomers and their superior ceramic technology and slit their wrists. But I don't think so.
Yeah. And that's one of the things too, is like the Norse and the Saxons coming in, and what they did to the Celt population in the UK,
Mhm.
and how it, I ended up with blue eyes as part of that, right?
Well, no, actually, the blue eyes started out in Western Europe. That was the original mutation. The people who came in from the East had the mutation for blonde or blonde hair
Okay.
and pale skin, but they had gray eyes when they had light eyes. It's still most common in Eastern Europe, and blue eyes were most common in the far west of Europe, and they met and mingled.
Okay.
Um, you know, so
One of
but
the interesting things for me is the ADHD and its prevalence amongst the Norse in particular.
yeah, well, they were impatient people.
Well, but they were also able to not be bored for extended periods of times with their hyper focus on
Mhm.
a sailing trip or whatever. They just kind of put it in neutral, and we're just hanging out.
Yeah,
But then your capacity for hyperviolence and hypervigilance
yeah.
would be pretty much an asset when you go on the raiding party going Viking.
Do you know what dialect of English became standard? It's the East Midland dialect, which is the Old Danelaw. Because when the Black Death hit England, it pretty well wiped out London,
Hmm.
and a wave of migrants from the East Midlands came down and settled in London after that, and that became the court dialect, and then the standard dialect of English. That's why we say sky instead of Luft. As late as the 17th century, people in Wessex, the southwestern England, said Luft for sky. It's German.
Right.
But we use the Scandinavian influenced dialect and we say sky.
It's such a trip. The amount of uh, for a place that is basically on the fringes of the world, and when it
Mm,
comes to Great Britain and the British Isles, how much movement there was even there. So when
yeah.
you're talking about your migration argument with people that are saying, "Oh, it didn't take place," my ass, it didn't take place, because even in the corner of the world, which was the British Isles, there was enormous amounts of migration, and not using muscle power, sail, and that's it. So
Well, you
yeah,
can walk from France to China in a summer,
right,
you know. So the world is not actually that big. And if you've got a horse and a couple of remounts, you can do it in about what, 2, 3 months.
right,
And yeah, unless someone kills you on the way.
yeah, and takes your horses.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
You know
there's
when the Huns didn't have stirrups. They had wood frame saddles, but no stirrups.
right,
The Avars, who came in about 100 years later, they brought stirrups west. And it took another 400 years for someone to realize, wait a minute, if I've got stirrups, I don't have to stab overarm with my spear. I can put it under my arm and use the horse's momentum to punch into the other guy.
right.
If you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, most of the Norman knights are still stabbing overarm
Yep,
with their spears. But shortly thereafter, the couched lance style came in.
yep,
That's one of the things Artorias introduces in the Winds of Fate.
right.
And the Parthian cataphracts, their heavy cavalry, are as he thinks, well, it's not quite like gunpowder against people who've never heard of it, but it's not exactly all that different either. When
Right.
they,
Yeah, the impact. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
they're true shock
punches,
troops.
it punches you out of the saddle,
Yep.
and especially if you don't have stirrups to brace yourself with or a raised cantle.
Yep. For sure.
So
No, it's an amazing, and again, it gets back to what you were talking about with it's a simple technology that they had everything they needed to build it, to do it. Just nobody come up with the idea, or they looked down on the people who had the idea, and then didn't use that, take it to the next level until they usually it involved getting their asses handed to them.
yeah,
That was when everybody's like, oh, maybe that's a good idea.
and like horseshoes. The
Yeah.
Romans had hippo sandals, which was a strap-on iron shoe they used mainly for horses that were having problems with chipping their hooves on roads. And horseshoes, they had all the technology. They had nails, they had blacksmiths, they
Right.
had wrought iron, so they could make horseshoes. They just didn't think of it.
Yeah.
Or wheelbarrows. That's one of the things Artorias introduces in To Turn the Tide. Um, you can push about 4 times the weight you can carry with a wheelbarrow.
Yeah.
And as he says it, the villicus, the manager of the villa they're on, uh, virtually creams his loincloth when he sees a guy trundling along with 4 big sacks of grain in
Right.
a wheelbarrow, because they would take 4 guys carrying that.
Yeah, and for people that aren't aware of it, the biggest thing about that is that the the energy consumed to carry the weight to bring the harvest in is therefore minimized. So you're
Yeah,
not consuming as much as what you're producing, which means you have a surplus, which means you can transport that surplus to somewhere else, et cetera. It could be sold, it could be used by other people. You could improve I mean, everything has a knock-on effect.
yeah,
One of Eric's favorite sayings was, and I can't remember who originally said it, but was, amateur study battles, professional study logistics, and
yeah.
that right there is a truly important, especially in an age of cavalry, is an incredibly important thing to know. Is that if you're using wheelbarrows, even if a person is using a wheelbarrow to get to the caravan or the wagon, that's that much less energy consumed, food consumed to get to the wagon.
Or horse collars. The Roman style harness for horses was based on an ox yoke, and horses just aren't shaped like ox yokes, like
No.
oxen. So it choked them,
Yeah, so
and
they weren't able to
only
apply all the power. Yeah,
they could only produce about half the effort that a good horse collar, where they can lean into it with their shoulders,
right.
produces, and that completely transforms draught, because basically what Romans used for draught was 2-wheeled ox carts. That was the major wheeled vehicle. They had bigger ones.
They're usually like what a third the speed of a pace capable of the pace of a horse, even
Yeah,
in walking. Like the walk of a horse is much faster than that of an ox.
and an ox has to rest a lot more. So that increases your speed, and
And then decreases
stagecoaches.
your logistics strain because you don't have to feed them as often when they stop. You don't have to water them. Everything kind of,
Yeah,
again, knocks on. So,
everything kind of speeds up. So there's a lot of basic technology like that, which has big knock-on effects. As I mentioned, cradle sides.
and now, as promised, one jump ahead. John Moore is a nanotech-enhanced soldier of fortune. Lobo is an AI, a living weapons and intelligence platform of enormous destructive potential. 2 very dangerous wolves in a galaxy of deadly corporate and paramilitary predators. But Moore has grown weary of the killing, and just once he'd like to finish a job without leaving a trail of blood behind him. Not going to happen. Not on a pristine planet called Macon, where 2 gigantic corporations vie for control of the local jump gate and access to the riches of an undeveloped world. Dealing with a kidnapping and extortion scheme is only the beginning for Moore and Lobo as they work to stay one jump ahead.
Observers in the town could no doubt apprehend more of the shape of each display than we could, but the show was still lovely and awe-inspiring, all the more glorious for the mixture of man-made beauty and natural wonders, the fireworks, the forest, the beach, and the ocean that you could truly appreciate only from on high. I tried to fix the scene in my mind. More than anything else, the image of Jasmine safe at home and this combination of sights were what I wanted to remember of Mackin. "The displays in firefights are more intense," Lobo said. "Yes," I agreed, "but not as varied in color and never as big a visual treat. More importantly, these make me happy. Nothing about a firefight is fun." When the display ended and the only lights in the area were the glowing pinpricks marking windows in the town's buildings, Lobo shot out of the atmosphere and into space. He closed the floor portal, and I strapped into an acceleration couch. I told him to alert me when we were close enough for a clear look at the gate. I've never been one to join a religion, nor have I ever found anything I was willing to pray to, but each time I see one of the jump gates, I understand for a moment why gatists worship them. The people who discovered the first gate in the asteroid belt in Earth's solar system must have felt the same sense of creepy awe I did. Every jump gate we find is different. They vary in mass and color, and of course the number and the sizes of the apertures they provide, but they all share several key features. Each resembles a collection of huge interwoven Mobius strips. The apertures, the holes formed by the weaving strips, range in size from barely large enough for a small shuttle to so huge the biggest spaceship can move easily through them with plenty of clearance. Each gate is utterly smooth, every centimeter of its surface apparently a perfect part of the whole. No one has ever spotted a seam or connection point. The gates are without visible physical flaws. None ever has a pockmark or a scrape or a scar of any sort. Nothing ever damages the gates. They seem to tolerate but not suffer from simple collisions with natural objects such as meteors. Attempt to hit them with anything man-made, however, and highly coherent energy flashes from points all over the gate's surface and coalesces into a beam that vaporizes the offending object. The gates also have no tolerance for violence anywhere near them. Launch a weapon within a gate's neutral zone, a sphere with the gate as its center in a radius of 1 light second, and both you and all your weapons get the same treatment. It doesn't matter if you're firing at a gate or shooting anywhere else within its sphere of influence. You must keep conflicts away from them. Gates inspire that kind of thinking. The notions that they don't tolerate this or don't like that, that they're living things with preferences. Those ideas may be right or they may not. We have no clue where the gates came from or whether they're creatures or machines or some other new thing for which we don't have the right terms. What we do know, though, is that if matter enters one of their apertures, it emerges almost instantly from an aperture of the same size somewhere else, somewhere typically many light years away. Ships must proceed through an aperture in single file, and they must not collide, because gates interpret collisions as violence and destroy all the vessels involved. Ships from opposite sides of an aperture also must take turns. Put 2 ships in an aperture at the same time, and both emerge as wreckage the consistency of dust.
This has been the Bane Free Radio Hour. Thanks for joining us at the heart of science fiction. Join us next week as we continue the interview of S.M. Stirling on his latest Bane book, The Winds of Fate. And later, we continue with part 17 of One Jump Ahead by Mark Van Naber. Score by Ruth Judkowitz.